As discussed in the Techbrarian Journal, two teenagers created a game called Bias Breaker, where some alternative players against traditional stereotypes went around and destroyed negative stereotypes. We also watched this tutorial by Warfame about how to create a first-person shooter. So now it's our turn. We're going to go onto Scratch, and we're going to begin by creating a sprite, and that sprite is going to be our shooter. So we're going to make a circle here. Maybe we'll fill it in with a color. And we're going to create, that's its head actually, and then we're going to create arms coming out. And even though I don't like guns or anything having to do with shooting, we are going to be making a gun sticking out of its arms. And it's going to look like that. And I'll fill it in with a darker gray. Okay, so now we have our guy who's walking around, or girl who's walking around being a shooter. Shame on them, but at least they're shooting down stereotypes. Next, we're going to create a script so that their arms move left and move right. And the way that we're going to do this is by saying, when I press the green flag, I want you to forever look for something. Not just once, but forever look for if this thing. And what is this thing? I want you to sense whether or not the left arrow is pressed. If you press the left arrow, then we go to motion. I want you to turn 5 degrees. So let's check that out. And now I want to do the same thing, but this time, if I press the right arrow, so we go back to sensing, if the right key is pressed, then I want you to turn right. Okay, so let's just try this out. Looks good. Now we're going to make the code for it to move forward. And we'll do that by saying one last set of code, and that is if the up arrow key is pressed, then move, let's say, we don't want it to move too fast, so we'll say 3 steps. So let's look at that. And we're just gonna move around like that. We're not going to have the down arrow do anything. So before we go any farther, a really good habit is always to name your sprites. We're gonna press this I right here, and we're gonna call this the blaster. We're going to call the whole thing the brainwash blaster. So this is our blaster, and then we're going to press this arrow again to return back. Just so you know, in case it's not clear, we're looking above. So this is the head from above, this is the arms from above, the gun from above. And now we're going to create the bullets. So let's click on this circle, let's make it solid over here, and let's go right over into the center, and don't make the bullets too big. So I'll make it about that big. And now let's do an I right here and call this bullet. Okay. Time to write the code for the bullet. I'm going to press events. When I press the green flag, go to looks, hide. Why am I making it hide? Because nothing's been shot yet. So you don't want to have a bullet appear until something is shot. Now here's the sort of challenging thing to understand. What we're dealing with for the bullets are clones. We're not going to create a separate sprite every time we want to fire a bullet. Otherwise, you're going to be creating a million sprites. And you don't need to do that because of something called a clone. We're going to have a clone of the bullet created every time the spacebar is pressed. We'll be putting the spacebar code back on the blaster in a moment. But for now, what you need to know is once this bullet appears as a clone, it'll be its very first time appearing, but it'll still be a clone. Once it's created as a clone, the first thing that it needs to do is go to the gun. Therefore, when I start as a clone, I go to looks, I show myself, and then inside of motion, I go to the blaster. And once I go to the blaster, I need to make sure that as I'm firing, I'm facing the right direction, because this is constantly switching directions. So I want to not only go to the blaster, but also point in the direction of where the blaster is pointed. To do that, you're going to go to motion, and you're going to say point in direction. Then we're going to do this little slightly tricky code. We're going to go down to here where it says X position of bullet, and we're going to change that to direction of blaster. So we're going to point in the direction of the blaster. So for instance, here, the blaster is pointed this way. And now the pointer's blast is pointing this way. So we're going to go to the blaster, point in the direction of the blaster, and then we're going to begin moving. And in order to do that, we're going to do this code here, which says that I want you to repeat moving forward. So repeat moving forward until you reach the edge. So this is under the sense block. And we're going to say we're going to repeat this until we're touching the edge. And finally, once we do touch the edge, we're going to disappear. And in order to do that, we're going to go to Control and delete this clone. So every time we press the space bar, this whole process is going to start. It's going to show, it's going to go to the blaster, point in the direction of the blaster, and it's going to keep moving until it reaches the edge and then die off, delete the clone. So the final step is really just to get the blaster to create the clone. And this is the code for that. If key space is pressed, then create the clone of the bullet, and we're going to have it just wait a second so that we don't fire too often. So let's test it out. Okay. Not that realistic, and there's a reason why. Do you see how the bullet is starting right here at the top of its head? Let's get it, instead of starting here, which is the center of this sprite, let's have it start about, this looks to me about 100 steps in front. So let's try going to the bullet, and we'll say when I start a clone, go to the blaster, point in the direction of the blaster, and let's move 20 steps, even before I start moving. 100 steps. Let's see how that looks. That's better. Okay, there's so many more ways to make this perfect, but this is pretty good. So this is part 1 of the tutorial. In part 2, we're going to show how to get some people to shoot. And who are we shooting? Stereotypes. So through the Techbrarian Media Literacy Guide, we learned about advertising tricks, and then we began talking about stereotypes in the media. We talked about women, men, and had a special edition of minority stereotypes. And then we showed some anti-stereotypes, and then I had you create your own anti-stereotypes. Well, all of these skills are going to come in handy now, because I'm going to ask you for this game to choose a stereotype and then shoot it down and create an anti-stereotype. So let's start with Muslims. So Muslims are terrorists. That is the stereotype that we see in the media. So let's see if we can break that stereotype. And an easy way to break the stereotype is by adding some of these colors. So let's say that rather than being a terrorist, our Muslim is a music composer who loves drawing. Now, to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new sprite. And just like you drew from up above your shooter, you're going to also draw up above your, in this case, Muslim. So we're going to draw our circle. Although this is the same color as the bullet, so let's make it a different color. We'll draw a yellow circle, and then we'll do its arms coming out like that. And we will write the word Muslim, and we'll write the word terrorist. And just to be clear, 99.99% of Muslims are peaceful people, and it is a garbage stereotype. So we're going to make that extra clear by creating another costume. And in this costume, we're going to, well, let's duplicate it by pressing duplicate. Now we have a second costume. We're going to erase, make the eraser larger. We're going to erase this, and instead we're going to say Muslim music composer. Let's just move that a little bit over here. Okay. You could add a lot more details, but let's just start with that. So when we first begin, we're going to start with this, costume number 1. So starting the game off, we're going to say when I press the green flag, oh, let's name him. Click the I, Muslim. So our Muslim terrorist is over here. Our goal is to have this terrorist head towards the blaster. In order to do that, we're going to do a forever code block. And that means I always want you to do this thing. And what I want you to always do is I want you to point towards the blaster. So point towards the blaster. And I want you to move. So that means that the Muslim terrorist sprite is going to point and move towards it. So we'll say move 1 step so it goes nice and slow. We don't want it to capture them too easily. So we're going to press the green flag, and there we go. It's heading right to them. Now we have to say what happens when this Muslim gets fired on. Right now, nothing. What we want is for this stereotype to go away and change to an anti-stereotype when it gets hit. So in order to do that, we need to find a way to get the costume to go from Muslim terrorist, which is costume 1, to costume 2, which is the Muslim music composer. So in order to do that, we're going to write a script. And that script is going to say if, then we're going to sense touching bullet. As this bullet has come, if it's touching me, the Muslim, then I want it to switch to costume 2. So that's under looks, switch to costume 2. So let's try it out. It worked. Now, we don't want it to just hang out as this music composer. We want to keep going with other fights, so we're going to have it hide. But we want it to show for a little bit before it hides, otherwise we won't see how it's changed. So we're going to say wait 2 seconds so we can get a good look at it, and then hide. All right, let's try that out. Great, it worked, but there's a problem. We are starting the game over again now, and there's no Muslim. So what you have to do is you have to say show at the beginning of the game, where it says when I press the green flag. And you'll notice that it's also appearing right where my blaster was. We have to tell it that we want it to come back here. So in order to do that, we're going to press stop. Then we're going to take our Muslim music composer and we're going to place him where we want him to start. When you go to motion, it automatically fills in that location. So now we're going to say, when I press the green flag, go here. So let's check this out. Looking good. But there's another problem. It's still the Muslim music composer. It didn't switch back. So we also have to tell it to switch back to costume 1 when we start the game. Okay. That looks great. Next up, we're going to make a point system. So let's call it brainwash. If we want to make a point system, we have to do what is called making a variable. So let's make a variable called brainwash. And right now the brainwash is set at 0, and we can set that brainwash to 0 at the beginning of the game. But what will happen to make this game into a real game is that if the Muslim does touch blaster, his or her brainwashing will go up by 1. So let's make that happen. Forever, point towards the blaster, moves 1 step towards the blaster, and if it's touched by the bullet, then it switches to costume 1. But now let's say if it touches the blaster, let's change brainwash by 1 because it's become more brainwashed. I hope you're following me. So I'm going to go control if touching blaster, then change brainwash by 1. And then I also want it to hide. It doesn't need to stay taking away points forever. Let's try this out. It's coming to us. It touches us and brainwash goes up by 1 and it disappears. Now that we've finished our Muslim stereotype and anti-stereotype, we're going to create one more. If you press the duplicate tool, it creates a copy of this sprite. And what's great about it is this whole code block is copied as well, so you don't have to redo it. There's going to be 1 or 2 things we're going to have to change, but I'll talk about that in a moment. So we have our copy of the Muslim. Let's change it to a new stereotype. We're going to go to costumes, and here we're going to, instead of using the eraser, let's use a different method. Let's use this select tool. It's a little bit easier, as you'll see. We're going to drag it around the Muslim terrorist, and we're going to press delete. For our new stereotype, we're going to use transgender woman. So we'll write transgender. And let's paint the transgender woman a different color. Let's do burgundy. I have to delete this. Okay. Now let's put a label. There's tons of false stereotypes, harmful stereotypes of transgender men and women. One of which is that they're confused. Another is that they're dancers. So let's go ahead and write transgender, confused dancer. Okay. And now let's think of a positive anti-stereotype. How about warm-hearted principal? Warm-hearted principal. Okay. Let's go back to scripts and press the green flag and see what's happening. Problem. The transgender woman and the Muslim are located in the same space, so they're right on top of each other, and it doesn't look so great, and it's a little confusing in the game. The reason why is because if you look at the code, right at the beginning, it starts here at this position, and because it was copied, the transgender woman is going to start in the same position. So instead, let's drag the transgender woman where we want her to start. And now let's separate this code block, get rid of this go-to statement, little code piece, and let's put this piece of code in there. It automatically was filled in by Scratch in this new location. And now let's reconnect the code block. And let's check it out. Perfect. For the final tutorial of this game, we're going to create a you win and a you lose sprite that appears if you win and if you lose. We're going to take our paint bucket and we're going to write in you win. And let's create a second costume. So I'm going to press this here, paint new costume, and we'll put you lose. Yep. You lose. Okay. Well, let's label this here. We'll call it win-lose. And we don't want this to appear in the beginning. No one's won or lost yet, so when I press the green flag, let's hide this. Let's take a moment to look at the final game so that we can talk about a slightly more difficult concept. So when I press the green flag, I have these two stereotypes headed for me. -1, I'm less brainwashed. -2, I'm even less brainwashed. And then the game ends because I've gone less than -1. In fact, I've gotten to -2. So your code is going to say if brainwash is less than -1, meaning it has to be -2, because you have two characters, two stereotypes you have to kill. Then you switch to you win. So let's go ahead and look at that code and recreate it ourselves. So to write that code, we'll say forever, I want you to look for something Scratch, if the points are less than -1, then show win. So remember, win is costume number 1 and lose is costume number 2. So if that's the less than symbol, if brainwash is less than 1, then show, because we want it to finally show, and switch to costume 1. And let's do another if statement. If costume is greater than 1, if brainwash is greater than 1, crap. So now let's write the code for win to show and lose to show. So win is costume 1 and lose is costume 2. And if you are able to shoot 1, it's -1. And if you're able to shoot a second stereotype, it's -2. Because each time you shoot a stereotype, you're going down by -1. You're getting less brainwashed. So let's write the code so that if it's greater than -1, meaning, less than -1, meaning you've shot 2. So -1, -2. So if it's less than -1, then let's trigger the win costume. So the way you write this code is, first of all, I want it to hide. And then forever, I want you to look for something scratch. Forever, if brainwash, this is the less than sign, if brainwash is less than -1, if brainwash is less than -1, then show. So show this costume, and let's make sure that we're switched to costume number 1. Last piece of code. If brainwash is greater than 1, then also show, but change to costume 2. Switch to costume 2. Okay, let's try it out. So here, we shot 1, and we shot 2. There we go, you win. Now let's get beaten by these stereotypes. Our brainwashing is going to go up 1 and then up 2, and it's going to trigger that. Up 1, up 2, you lose. And there you have it. You have created an anti-stereotype game called Brainwash Blaster.